Thank you very much, everybody, for coming here and joining us to this Eteron Institute for Research and Social Change first discussion here at the Delphi Economic Forum. We are very, very glad to have with us today Professor Adam Tooze. He's a professor at Columbia University. He's teaching history, and he's the director, if I'm correct, of the European Institute.
Yep.
And in the last week, I'm sorry, I will do it, we saw a cover magazine at the New York Mag that he is the man who explains everything. So we have the difficult task of explaining everything in 29 minutes, I think. And I'm sure that we'll fail this task. But let's start our discussion. So Adam, I have a simple question. There are not simple questions, but anyway, for the beginning, recently I read something that you wrote at Financial Times. I think you were talking that we are actually experiencing a reconfiguration of globalization and not a deglobalization, because we see now after the economic sanctions on Russia that there are new financial and trade linkages between Russia, China, India, and I would like to ask you if you think that there is a rebalancing of power between the United States and the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's a perhaps somewhat fussy point, but it does seem helpful to me to think in terms of reconfigurations of globalization rather than deglobalization. Mm-hmm. The trigger for this piece was a letter to shareholders by Larry Fink, the legendary CEO of BlackRock, and when Larry Fink blows his nose, the world pays attention. And he produced what I thought was, in the end, not a very convincing account of the shock of Ukraine. And this then became a story about deglobalization. And I really don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about our current situation. If you think about, say, the supply chain narrative, which comes up so often, basically, it takes a supply chain to beat a supply chain. So if Germany is now serious, for instance, about uncoupling from Russian gas, what does it do? Well, in the first instance, it's going to build new LNG terminals, which we may argue about as a strategic policy. And then it's going to do a new gas deal with Qatar. So it doesn't end globalization. It reconfigures it and places it in a new set of relationships. Within these polarized groupings, we may see much tighter connections. And this is also something we've seen in history, of course. If you think about the way in which economic connections were reconfigured within Europe and the United States in the course of World War II, including Greece in the Marshall Plan era. But I think then also it's very interesting to separate out from this issue of, as it were, the shape and the map of globalization, the question of power. And I think part of our problem is that we've come out of an era, arguably two eras, in which the notion of power, the concept of power, was simple. It was kind of like a shish kebab, if you like everything lined up on a single spear. You had the military dimension, you had the economic dimension, you had the cultural dimension, you had the diplomatic dimension, you had the soft power media sphere, and they all, in a sense, could be articulated around a single axis. And this is classically true, again, of the 1945 period. It's classically true to an extent of the unipolar moment in the 1990s as well. And I think that a characteristic feature of our current period, and one that makes analysis incredibly difficult, which is why we end up with these big, baggy terms like the reconfiguration of globalization. Like, what does that mean? Part of our problem is that they've all come apart. So in the Ukraine crisis, we're seeing a massive affirmation of unipolar financial power. It turns out that it's not just the dollar, it's the dollar and the euro together. And when you put them together, that's 80% of everyone's assets. And on the other hand, in the sphere of trade, for instance, we're seeing just irresolvable multipolarity. America cannot dictate trade policy in Asia anymore because it's simply not the largest economic actor in that space. Mm-hmm. And in the military sphere, again, we see bipolarity, different dimensions. So I think our problem as analysts and our problem as citizens coming to terms with this situation is simply that power doesn't line up in the way that it used to. This may present opportunities in some senses, because there may be opportunities for reclaiming power in certain dimensions. But it also makes things very, very confusing. And the worry, of course, is that powers might be tempted, as it were, to translate their relative strengths in one domain into claims on the other. And looking at America, that's what I'm particularly worried about, is that essentially it retreats to financial and military dominance, in a sense, precisely because it cannot really act as a counterweight in the trade sphere, for instance, anymore, or in the sphere of cultural hegemony after Trump. Yep. You know, the legitimacy of American democracy is a busted flush.
Thank you very much. And this helps me to come to the second question, which actually we're changing a little bit the geographical setting in the global map, and we're coming to Eurozone. Most of the people have read what you've written in your book, Crust, about the Eurozone crisis. And a couple of months ago, I would ask you, before the war in Ukraine, I would ask you if you think, what are the prospects in terms of economic policy for the Eurozone, because we have seen a lot of transformations, most of the always delayed, of course, in Eurozone in terms of economic policy, and a lot of complexity is added on from the war in Ukraine because the energy factor comes into the model. So that's a very difficult question in my mind, and I don't know how you will answer to this in the next 5 minutes. So I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, there is nostalgia, isn't there? I mean, yeah. In a sense, wouldn't we rather be talking about inflation and
Truly.
Eurozone
Truly.
than what we actually have to be talking about? I mean, so, and I think there's also a question, and this is a haunting question of like, when do we exit the Ukraine moment? Are we perhaps exiting the Ukraine moment? Do we get back to the place of normal politics in Europe, where we will be arguing about the familiar issues for Greeks, achingly familiar issues of Eurozone and Eurozone governance? I don't think there's a simple answer to this question, because I think ultimately it's open and it's political. So rather than putting, as it were, a social scientist hat on and saying, well, these are the trends and this is, you know, where we're necessarily headed, surely the state of play in the Eurozone, at least since the critical break between March 2020 and May, June 2020, is one of an open play. But by that break, I mean, as we went into the COVID crisis, it seemed like we were simply going to replay 2010 all over again. You know, the southern countries would come with corona bonds and the Germans would say no again. And we would be stuck in that old trench warfare. And by April in 2020, things were very critical. If you knew anyone who was involved in Eurozone decision-making, they were in a bad, dark place. And somehow then the door opened in late April, early May, and we know that it was some sort of deal that was done between Paris and Berlin, mediated by key players on both sides, including Olaf Scholz and his team at the German Finance Ministry. But then the question is, what opened at that moment? And that, I think, is the question which Europe has to struggle over actively, not, as it were, as a matter of social scientific prediction. Because on the one hand, and all the way down to conversations I've been having with people in Berlin this week, the line is, it was an exceptional emergency measure that we took. And of course, on the other hand, speak to anyone in France, Italy, Spain, presumably in Greece, the question is whether it was not a precedent for something better. And that argument is live. It's absolutely live. And I think it's a matter of power plays. The French elections will matter. The state of the balance of power in the German coalition will matter. Who Christian Lindner turns out to be will be a matter. You know, who he decides he wants to be over the summer. You know, is he the friendly hawk or whatever he likes to call himself? You know, these are issues that are going to have to be fought out. They're political, fully political, in the real electoral sense. And this is the counter to the idea that all of this takes place in Europe behind closed doors amongst bureaucrats. There is an element of that. But it's actually also a weird kind of multidimensional live politics that happens. And you, in Greece, have been the victims of that in a very dramatic way, because it doesn't always play out in a nice fashion. More democracy doesn't necessarily give you more liberal policies. But there are fundamental structural problems, right? And they can't be denied. And the big, if we were having this conversation in January and February, we would simply have been looking at the debt levels. We would have been looking at the spreads and the Italian spreads. No one bothers with the Greek ones, which is largely because the Greek debt is held by public actors. But they focus on the Italian spreads, and we saw how nervous they were in January and February. We were talking about the intra-ECB politics of, you know, Schnabel and Lagarde and Knut and Lane, and how they were all jockeying for position and how the markets were reacting. And that just shows you how labile this potentially is, because there is no good answer to the Italian debt issue, bracketing the Greek debt issue, other than either continuing the status quo, not asking any difficult questions, agreeing not to look down, just to keep, as it were, the wheels spinning in midair, or rapid nominal GDP growth. And so that could come from next-gen EU, but does anyone really believe that it's going to accelerate Italian GDP growth by that much? Or could this be the hidden gift of 4 or 5% inflation? Because if you were in the business of actually trying to unwind the unsustainable debt to GDP ratios, and you were looking for historical examples of how to do that, you look at Britain and the United States after World War II, and in the 1950s and 60s, these were moderate inflation environments, 2 to 4 to 5%. And that will get your debt to GDP level down. And so no one wants to say this in Europe because, of course, we're all committed to price stability. But frankly, if you were actually trying to eat away at the Italian one, which is doable, the Greek one is too big, but the Italian one, you could maybe get yourself down to 130% of GDP if we had 5 years of 5% nominal GDP growth. So I'm an inflationist at heart, but I'm surprised. Perhaps it's not surprising that this can't be spoken out loud. That would get us somewhere. But it's a question then of not tightening too quickly. So I'm very much a kind of somebody who's in the camp of saying this is it's up for grabs to be played for. A lot of policy decision-making has to be done here. And the inflation spike is hard to deal with. And as I gather was being discussed in the previous conversation, it clearly has major social ramifications. That has implications for electoral politics. All of that has to be taken seriously.
Yes. In Greece, because of the situation in the last decade, we are very good in debt sustainability mathematics and variables.
You know
all the things that you say are have a lot of practical meaning for the Greek debate as well. But this gives me the pass to go into another question that has to do also with debt dynamics and inflation, because obviously, the era of great moderation belongs to the past. We have inflation hiking not for the monetarist doctrine reasons, but due to supply chain disruptions and energy spikes. And there is a big question that actually right now, the era of zero or negative interest rates also seems to start belonging to the past, because ECB and the Fed are planning hikes, increases in key interest rates and all that. And there is a big question because, okay, inflation can be good for debt sustainability. At the same time, if interest rates increase, there is a lot of difficulties, especially in the developing countries, with all this debt burden that they carry with them. And maybe, do you find any similarities with the 80s and the international debt crisis in the developing world?
I think this is a really key question. I think this is also something, I personally feel we should campaign on, because there is a sort of Eurocentric, Western-centrist focus which has to be counteracted. The best managed public debts are, like countries like Italy, where they have incredible experts managing their public debt because they have to. Yep. And they've been brilliant at extending the maturities of their debt. So an immediate increase in interest rates is not going to kill Italy. But I do think we need to be looking at the more fragile emerging markets and low-income countries. And the World Bank and the IMF, to their credit, have been banging the drum now for 3 years, saying tension is mounting. The model of not the Great Moderation, but of the last 10 years, in which low-income countries went to private markets and borrowed, euro dollars, effectively offshore dollars, not just from China, but from Western lenders, has created a hugely more complex situation than we've been in before, because restructuring this mixture of bilateral, multilateral, Chinese, private is very complicated. The experience of 2020 was in no way encouraging. The private creditors were not generous, and the low-income countries were very reluctant to ask for debt relief, even when it was offered, because they didn't want to ruin their credit ratings. And they're now they're facing a triple whammy, right? Rising energy costs, rising food costs, and rising interest rates. Now, for some, like Algeria, which we were worrying about, Brazil, we were worrying about, there's a huge relief, because commodity prices are going on, and those are big, big stories, right? If either Algeria or Brazil suffer a major crisis, this is huge for Europe, it's huge for Western Hemisphere. They may be in the clear, right? But Tunisia, all of a sudden, Sri Lanka is looking very, very fragile. They're actually just flat out of diesel. Yeah. And in a country that runs on generators, that's catastrophic. Is it going to be like the 80s? I think from a, this sounds callous, but like just from shares of global GDP, no way, right? I mean, 1980s was entire Latin America and all the American banks were tightly hooked up with it. Citigroup was going to blow up, or its predecessors were. That's not where we're at. But is this potentially going to affect a good slice of the world population? 500, 600, 700 million people are in the frame here, absolutely. And if we are serious about geo-economic competition, this is the moment to step up. Like Sri Lanka is ground zero for the Chinese debt imperialism story. That's where it was coined. And where are the Americans, where are the Indians going to be in relation to this? And Tunisia needs to be a matter of absolutely prime concern for Europe. It's good to see that the EU has stepped in, because that is another refugee crisis potentially, or a failed state crisis in the making, and Europe needs to take a much more expansive view of North Africa generally. And that's obviously of prime concern to Greece.
Thank you so much. The topic of our discussion is in search of new economic justice paradigm in turbulent times. So far we have described the turbulent times, and we have 10 minutes to start talking a little bit about the prospects from a progressive side. So after the pandemic, we have seen a lot of things changing in terms of economic policy. We have seen fiscal policy that has a lot of public expenditures in the United States and in the Eurozone as well.
Even in Greece?
Even in Greece as well.
Very large.
Okay, so you see there was not a debt issue,
All of a sudden.
which is such a political issue in the end of the day, whatever. And we have also seen a monetary policy, a very expansionary monetary policy, and the Fed and the ECB purchasing a lot of assets and all that. At the same time, we've seen, for example, President Biden speaking about the failure of trickle-down economics, which is in the very core of neoliberalism. I remember after the crash of 2008, there were a lot of discussions about the strange non-death of neoliberalism and all that. And the big question now, there's a specter haunting all the progressives people. Is neoliberalism coming to an end? Do you have an answer to that big, vital question? In 4 minutes, please.
Yeah, so okay. It's so hard to resist. I'm not going to resist. This is a great audience. So, what is neoliberalism? Part of the problem is it's like this sort of, it's not so much a vampire squid as just like a jellyfish kind of concept. Like it's everywhere and nowhere. As an ideological system, it seems to be dead, right? I mean, who would want to self-describe as a neoliberal at this moment? It's not coherent. It's not attractive. So at that level, I think, yeah, you could say it's over. It's no longer inspiring. It was an inspiring political project in its heyday. Yep. I'm old enough to remember how exciting it seemed in some ways, even if terrifying. However, you could also think of neoliberalism as a form of governance, and that's where I think practices of government. And at that level, it's much more resilient, tougher to kill. And the Biden team and all his folks are resolutely part of that system. I mean, the administration is studded with brilliant people who've made their careers at BlackRock. That in and of itself is a neoliberal phenomenon, right? That they can Absolutely. Oscillate in and out of government and into business like that. And so the solutions they come up with tend to be public-private partnership type solutions. And those are the flavor du jour in relation to climate, global development, right? Yep. Billions into trillions, leverage, the Juncker investment plan. That's all a kind of neoliberal model of policy, which I just somehow don't think we're ever going to truly escape. You can see the Green New Deal is saying, no, we need a big green government that's going to own things and do it that way. And we should definitely experiment with that. I would like to see a mixture. But are we really overthrowing it? I don't know. Another way of defining neoliberalism is as a social project. It's a form like, as Warren Buffett said, it's class war, and my side is waging it, and we won. Warren Buffett, 2006. Can we honestly say that anything has changed at that level? Clearly not. There are more enlightened, more interests taking over, but no real fundamental pushback. And the fourth dimension, and this is the one where I think you can be most decisive, is that neoliberalism was a project of American power. That's what it was really about. This is a big part of the Greek left critique, is that this is essentially American imperialism writ in economic form. That, I think, is the dimension where America's position is most challenged. But what comes after it? This is also, I think, the next question to ask. After neoliberalism, does anything good come? And what comes after neoliberalism, if you think of it as it were, the end of American hegemony and facing the China challenge could be some sort of authoritarian, nationalist, militarist hardening of power. So those, I mean, this is not really an answer so much as a grid for thinking about this problem. And I think it's very multidimensional and fast-moving. Certainly, the game has shifted. Things don't stack anymore. Yep. But in certain crucial ways, we're all children. I mean, you and me being the age we are, we're children of that project. In our biographies, neither of us is ever going to escape it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And this gives me the pass for the last question, which is very much related to what you were saying, so you can develop your argument more if you want. I was listening to your, I don't remember where, but you were suggesting one book about the end of history, which is a great book, and I read it because of your suggestion. And I remember I was reading something there that actually, on the one hand, there is the end of history with capital H. At the same time, the authors are arguing that the problem is that the history hasn't started over again. On the one hand, history has stopped. On the other hand, history has started getting written. It reminds me of Gramsci and the era of the monsters, as we translate it in Greece. So the big question, I mean, we are watching here from the other side of the Atlantic, things that are happening in the United States with all this progressive movement for Green New Deal, with new trade unions in Amazon, in Starbucks, and all that. At the same time, there is a lot of social and political experimentation in Europe as well. So what do you think? I mean, what are the preconditions in order to start writing history with a capital H, again, in a progressive, I hope, way?
Well, first of all, you know, the central question is, what do we make of the macroeconomic agency that we know we have? I mean, look at Greece's interest rates during the COVID crisis, for crying out loud. There was a moment where I believe they went negative, or at least to zero. Same country, even more debt than before. And yet all of a sudden no longer a problem. Doing a stimulus worth 15, 16, 17% of GDP, and entirely appropriately. And being applauded for doing it. And why is it not a problem? Because the ECP is buying the debt. We know what the answer to this question is, right? So if we want to take control of economic history, we know that we have the capacity to do it to a certain extent. That's the kind of 30,000 feet view of this. That needs to be there, because otherwise there are no options. And no one in Greece needs to learn that lesson again. If you turn the macroeconomic valve off, everything else stops. At the ground level, I think the COVID crisis also taught some really profound lessons. And for me, in an odd way, they all come to revolve around the question of intergenerational equity. They come to revolve around the question that we sacrifice the interests of young people to protect the health of the elderly. And it was the right thing to do. Yep. Right? But the question then is, what's the payback? What's the compensation? What's the social justice offset? If you look at the problem of the labor market, it's fundamentally a problem of labor market entrance almost everywhere, particularly in stressed labor markets like the Greek or Spanish or Italian labor markets. It's the youth unemployment that's the scandal, right? Yeah. If you look at the problem of poverty, what does it center on? It centers scandalously on children and parents, and above all mothers, in fractured modern families. That's where the problem is. It is far harder than it ought to be to raise kids in rich societies. It's ridiculously difficult for young people to have families. Yep. And this problem spirals out and out and out. If you think about what the migration problem is driven by, it's fundamentally the desperation of that same cohort in Africa. It's Generation Z in West Africa, in the sub-Saharan African countries, that are the critical generation globally for the next 20 to 30 years. Because the really novel feature of the new history is the African demographic explosion. The rebalancing to Asia, that's old. That's just history going back to where it always was. China and India used to be the center of the world. Africa with 2 billion people, that's a completely novel configuration we've never seen before. Yeah. So, and climate ditto, also a generational issue. So for me, that turns out, I think, in a weird way, and I speak as somebody deep into middle age at this point, like, as being the hub. And I don't really think that we have a good way of articulating those issues, other than it's easy to make that list. Yeah. So, but then how do you empower what in Western countries is an increasingly small electorate, one which is hard to organize, which is overwhelmed by the burdens that it's faced and quite disillusioned? Yep. And so how does one make this more than just a politics from above, but actually a politics of engagement and mobilization? I think that's, to me, the big challenge of the current moment.
I think that's the big challenge for everybody who has to do with something with politics, in order to find a way to combine this politics from above and politics from below with social movements and all that. And this is a key question for everybody. For me, this is, I mean, on the one hand, this is I get something optimistic out of this discussion, and at the same time a consideration about the big challenges that we're having in front of us. Last question, because we have 2 minutes in front of us. You are talking in your last book, Shutdown, which is getting translated now in Greece and will get published next month, about the polycrisis. And polycrisis has been, we were discussing it before, Greece has been a setting for this polycrisis. Do you think that from now on, the way that the world is organized, we will have different kind of crises in a more often way, and how can we, what is the environment that will be heading?
Well, it's genuine. I mean, for me, the fundamental challenge is to understand this openness, right? It genuinely is. I mean, you were talking about the end of history, and has it really restarted? Well, maybe it's restarted, but in a shape that we don't recognize, because it's not moved forward by the huge narratives of, I don't know, the organized working class, or in much of Europe, the national appeal has, you know, it has an appeal to some people, but is it really a progressive, future-orientated conversation, or one that's really defensive fundamentally? And I think our difficulty in Greece for this is really an extraordinary laboratory of working through how you think about the climate problem, the problems of inequality and instability in global capitalism, the huge intergenerational issues, the liminal position of Greece between the rich world and Africa and Asia. That is, as it were, the urgency that we face, and how you articulate that within a democratic politics that is also not simply catering to the lowest common denominator, but is actually trying to articulate knowledge, right? Our great tool in facing these problems, knowledge into an effective politics. That's, I think, also something where Greece has lessons to teach us about both the potential and the limits of that kind of politics in the current moment.
Thank you so much, Adam. From behalf of Eteron Institute, we want to thank you and all of you. It was a great discussion, and we were very, very glad to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Real privilege. Thank you.